All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Joanne Littlefair, and I'm the organiser of the People and Nature Lab seminar series. Today, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Melissa Leach, who is Honorary Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Cambridge, and also the Executive Director of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, and she will be giving her talk, Nature Kind, Language, Culture and Power Beyond the Human. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much, and also for being here and online on this very busy early part of the term. It's great to see you, and an absolute privilege to have this as an opportunity to talk about a book that just came out last week. And it's here, it's called Nature Kind. I've got a few flyers at the front as well, in case anyone's interested. And I really want to share some of the arguments and illustrations today, and see if we can start a conversation about some of what it says, because I think it brings together perspectives that many of us and many of you from diverse backgrounds might have to contribute to in their integration. So this is a book that, okay, this is now not working here. Okay, down, no. It's not going. Do I have to do that every time?
No, it seems to be fine now.
It seems to be fine. Okay, right.
Sorry.
So the book is co-written with my husband and long-standing research partner, James Fairhead, and it draws on the work we've done together and with research groups at Sussex, where until recently I was director of the Institute of Development Studies there, on people and nature and the politics of science and policy in relation to forests and soils, and also health. And the context in which we came to write this is a pretty big one for biodiversity and nature. I think it's the perilous state of life on Earth. And the argument in many quarters, including in the transformative assessment published by IPBES last year, which I think puts it very well, that we're going to need really quite fundamental transformative change to build flourishing futures for people and the rest of nature on this planet that we share. And what the assessment tells us is that the impacts are enormous, and the drivers are not just direct, but they're also indirect, and they have some quite fundamental underlying causes. And the one I'm particularly interested in today is this one at the top, the disconnection from and domination over nature and people. And turning to the framework that IPBES offers us for transformation, this final circle has some really key principles, again, which are quite core to what we try and do in Nature Kind. This one about building respectful and reciprocal human-nature relationships, and then the ways that connects up to questions of equity and justice. And what I want to talk about today is what we've made as a kind of offer and contribution into this area. Our particular focus is communication, and how communication underpins connections between people and the other aspects of nature, and helps to create communities and indeed cultures, as I'll be arguing, that are more than human, that extend us beyond the human. And to make that kind of argument immediately brings us into a challenge to some really deeply rooted ideas that have held humankind up to be exceptional. In the sciences, in Western religions, which would put God at the top of this great chain of being, moving down the hierarchies of other plants, and would also see certain kinds of people to be in a hierarchy over and above others. But this hierarchy of life and hierarchy of human and non-human, we think, keeps a disjuncture that actually works quite badly against the kind of connections we need for a thriving world. And it works against what many people around the world, including those who might identify as Indigenous people, but also all of us really in our everyday lives, have long known in living interdependently with non-human animals and plants and the world around, and indeed communicating with them. Who in this room, while many of you might work as a scientist, doesn't then sometimes go home and cuddle your companion cat or dog or the plant on your windowsill? Who doesn't have, when they're, I don't know, digging in their garden or walking in the park, find that something calls out to you in nature that has an appeal that's emotional, that goes beyond the objective sciences through which we might see it? And these are experiences that are often delegitimized by formal science and education, but they're there and they're important. And our book, Nature Kind, was prompted partly by a will to take them seriously, but also by a reading of biology and what we call a biological revolution, in a way that makes that possible in new ways, but which also requires us to dig deeper and link up with some other perspectives that come out of my own discipline, anthropology, which has always concerned itself with just the human. So anthro, it's there in the title, it's the thoroughly anthropocentric discipline, but yet to argue that it actually offers us something different if thought about in new ways to understanding the more than human world. So the material we draw on in the book is partly based on the field research I've done over long periods in West Africa with James and with other colleagues. But it also draws on our own everyday lives at home, where we live in Sussex, and our own reflections on our relationships with our chickens, with our equines, with our young trees. And then it also draws on rapidly expanding literatures in the biological sciences, in those in the anthropology and the environmental humanities who have looked at post-human and more than human worlds, and particularly the work of Indigenous scholars and those who've sought to bring their work to attention. And these offer particular lenses that what we've tried to do is, by bringing them together, help them to amplify each other in a way that I hope gives greater value to each without somehow instrumentalizing them. So what we're trying to do in the book is argue for an understanding of language and culture that unites rather than dividing, that is not human exceptionalist or indeed biologically exceptionalist, which gives one sense to our title, Nature Kind, of which we are all part. But there's another sense too, which is the kindness bit, to ask how, by recognizing better these communicative connections and the language that links them together, can we seek to build perhaps a kinder, more thriving set of flourishing relations that we're all going to depend on. So what I want to do in this talk is first lay out the conceptual argument and the sort of building blocks of it, which takes place in the book in quite a long and actually quite academic and highly referenced chapter. I think when we set out, we thought we're going to write quite a popular book. And actually, we've needed to go to the literature, to go to the evidence, and that is explained there. And I'm going to do some radical summarizing. And then I want to share just a few of the examples from the book where each of the chapters deals with a different kind of interspecies relation that people establish with cats and chickens and horses and bees and bats, and then with wider assemblages of forests and soils and seas and cities. And then at the end, I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of the implications that we spell out in a final chapter that we've called a political nature kind. So to start with the building blocks, the first, I think, is this, what I would see anyway, as a biological revolution. And it's one that I think many people in the People and Nature Lab are a very important part of. It's one which has witnessed huge advances in biology and ecology and the technologies for their study, which has transformed our understandings of animal and plant communication, and with it, non-human animal and plant culture. So in terms of communication, what this work is showing is not just sophisticated signaling across a spectrum of senses, so the sound and the sonic, the visual, the tactile, electromagnetic, chemical, but also that these things come together in syntax or grammar, and they often involve symbolism. So bees communicate information, as is well known, through their waggle dances, but also with less well-known headbutts and airflows. There's symbolism involved, it involves signs and it involves syntax. And the meanings differ between hives. Each hive has its own linguistic community, you could say also has its own culture. Digital analysis of bird calls reveals sequences of signs and patterns that really matter to the interpretations of the other birds that are listening. And all life turns out to be cultural, with the expanding recognition that social learning operates within groups to convey different ways of behaving, different ways of being within the same species. So that many biologists are now talking about culture as a second inheritance system. So whale cultures, as we know, vary by clan, with different dietary traditions, hunting practices, song genres. Songbirds learn dialects. Many migratory birds learn their roots through social learning. Even fruit flies, it turns out, transmit mating preferences culturally across generations. So this is a massive work, and it's expanding through technologies and through growing theorization of cognition and of communication. But it tends to be quite confined in the majority of this work, partly because of the methods used, to cue and response and to signals that are responded to in a way that's seen as functional to evolution. Explanations are often very parsimonious, and ultimately they're quite mechanical. And the biological scientists looking at culture and social learning, again, have made do with quite a limited, parsimonious understanding of socially learned behaviours and the outcomes of kind of cumulative conditioning, which gets passed on. These are very, very different from social scientists' understanding of these things. The making of meaning in the social science world that I come from has a whole discipline called semiotics, which is the science of signs and of how they make meaning through their combination juxtapositions. Webs of meaning are at the heart of what the social sciences and humanities would identify as culture. And indeed, if you're an anthropologist like I am, you'd see it as terribly flawed to try and study human society or culture by observing the kind of varied regularities of people's behaviour without paying attention to the categories, the classifications, the meanings that are actually shaping these forms of social practice and the communicative relations underlying them. So now we know that things linguistic and things cultural are also part of our non-human world. We think that we might actually have to say it's just as flawed for primatologists or zoologists to be studying chimps and entomologists to be studying bees in such ways. Is it time that if this biological revolution is to move on further, it begins to develop and engage more fully with a theory of meaning? Now, interestingly, there is a subfield that purports to study exactly these things. And I'm going to do a quick show of hands. Which of you in this room have ever heard of or indeed read anything that claims to be biosemiotics? Amazing. Okay, so halfway through writing this book, we discovered this field that said it was doing exactly what we were arguing needed to be done. It's a rather small field. It emerged from about the 1970s. And it's quite focused and institutionalized around rather few people and journals, but it claims to extend semiotics, this wider, long-standing study of meaning making in people, to the wider biological world. So my first question is, why is this almost unknown amongst biological scientists and indeed amongst social scientists, which is puzzling? We then looked into it, but we also found a quite serious limit, because while this is a field of work that, yes, takes into account multimodal signing in the non-human, the sensory repertoire, which it really focuses on around the idea of Umwelt, it limits itself to a particular reading of signs and semiosis, which go back to a slightly obscure 19th century theorist called Charles Peirce, who said there are three kinds of signs. There are indexical signs, which transmit their meaning very directly, as smoke links to a fire, for instance. There are what he called iconic signs, which represent something by likeness, the way perhaps a portrait links to a person. And then there are symbolic signs, but nothing in the non-human world uses symbolism. And symbolism requires a code. You have to learn it. You have to learn what this symbol applies to. And that, the biosemioticians said, is linguistic, and that remains only human. So what biosemiotics did was to say we can understand our worlds through non-linguistic forms of signing, but they maintained this separation between the human and the non-human, this kind of human exceptionalism, by saying that actually it's only people who do symbolism and for whom learning codes and conventions makes sense. So we thought that's actually pretty inadequate, but really crucially, this, which claims to link to the biological sciences, although hardly anyone's heard of it, is now really at odds with what the biological revolution is showing us about symbolism and culture, which does operate amongst all sorts of non-human beings. So what we then tried to do is to say, if we've got a bit of an impasse here where things are mechanomorphic and we haven't got a mode of theory in the biological world to take it forward, what happens if we try and bring some social science perspectives to wider life? To take that work, the sociologists who thought community is only about human communities, the anthropologists who've only looked at anthropology, and the social semioticians who've only looked at the human, and now say, let's take this into the wider world. So a lot of what we do in the book goes back to structural linguistics, which was again developed only for people, and particularly the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, for whom the communication of meaning, or what he called signification, always depends on a combination of two structural principles. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it's worth just outlining what he meant. The first relates to grammar, where meaning always depends on how signs are combined, how they're ordered. And that's important because put a word out of place, as one might in a sentence, and others notice effortlessly, almost immediately. And structural anthropologists like Levi-Strauss and particularly Mary Douglas took that into social practice and observed that all social and cultural life is similarly shaped by grammars like that. There are grammars, there are orderings in how you're dressed, in how people behave at a meal, that everyone in a common social world comes to know, even if they can hardly articulate it. But you'd know when it was wrong. So here's a picture of people, they happen to be Cambridge students out on a field trip, and they're all dressed to a code that creates that social world of being on an ecology field trip. If somebody was there in a party dress, people go, it's as it were a category mistake. And by making that mistake, as it were, that matter out of place, as Mary Douglas would have put it, you immediately show up the ordering, the expectation, the patterning, the culture. There are grammars in that way that configure, I think, every aspect of our lives, and humans in their social lives have an intense understanding of order and tend to understand things that contravene that order immediately. You can think about it that actually there's a clear evolutionary advantage to it, or a survival advantage, at least to a social survival advantage. Knowing when something's out of place is pretty important to remaining part of your group. And that business of being matter out of place is also the first building block of language, according to the structural linguist. But Saussure also had a second quite important principle, because he argued that all concepts or signs acquire their meaning not on their own, but within a field of meaning, according to the things that they're not. So no gesture, no food item, no way of passing the salt, nothing that you might, no shoe, no coat, nor puffer jacket carries meaning on its own, but always in relation to the other things that it isn't. It's a puffer jacket, not a fur coat. It's a passing things nicely as opposed to throwing them on the floor. So there are contrasts in life, and we partly come to know what's right and how to behave and how to communicate through those contrasts. And the important thing is that these things are inherently arbitrary, and they're learned through codes and conventions, and that's what makes language, that's what makes culture. But the question is, are these things uniquely human? Actually, they're not. Neither of those structural principles applies only to people. The gestures of a cat's tail or a horse's ears, the chemical emissions of trees, we find, make sense in relation to other gestures, other ear positions, other chemical emissions or no chemical emissions. And they make sense in relation to their ordering and sequencing, their syntax or their grammar. Social semiotics, which we can take into wider life, also tells us that the capacity to convey meaning builds up over time. It builds up with memory. And think about it in the human world. If I choose to wear a particular coat, it might be the one that was a birthday present from somebody I liked, and I put it on, and it kind of condenses for me all those meanings about the history of that friendship and the way that came to be, a bit of a story. Memory. All beings, it turns out, or more beings are being shown to have memory, including plants, including fungi, as well as non-human animals. And so I think we can begin to ask about how packages of meanings build up through memory. Meanings are also shaped by place, by context. So, for instance, the call of a monkey from up a tree might warn of an eagle, but the same call would convey a very different meaning when uttered on the ground. So just as we humans learn to establish orderly, regular exchanges of meaning with each other and with particular places, so too do other beings. So making those arguments, drawing those fields together, we offer a theory of meaning for biology and for all disciplines. And we call it structural biosemiotics. So it's kind of linking this structural work in the social sciences up with and filling in the holes in biosemiotics. And it suggests that all beings are communicating through these multimodal signing processes. They're ordered, often subconsciously, and they can become packages. They become what we call meta signs, or indeed stories or narrative genres, and they build up over time. So narrow human language, which is, of course, super important to humans based on speech and on writing, becomes a mere subset of that wider range of meaningful communication. And that's how we come to sort of reconfigure language in broader, more than human terms, and therefore reconfigure humankind as part of nature kind, do away with that exceptionalism. So that's the kind of conceptual ambition of the book. So let's look at a few examples of how we try to show this. We sort of try and develop it through various chapters, which have particular themes, but they also have particular areas of focus. I'm going to start with horses, which actually show the grammar of companionship quite well. And so to start really personally, this picture here is me riding our companion family horse, Louis, in our field in the foothills of the South Downs. And I ask him to walk and then trot round a circle, and we find our direction and our rhythm through a combination of signs of pressure and touch from legs and hands, which his body movement responds to. And sometimes through sound. So he's learned that if I say good boy in a certain tone of voice, that elicits a response. And these come together in a kind of grammar. One can be riding around a circle, steering. A bird might fly up from the hedge. The horse startles and shies, and it takes a coordination of hand and leg to encourage back to the track and move on. It's a conversation, and it feels like a conversation, and the literature on horses describes it as such. But it's not one that's confined to English riders on the South Downs, which is where a lot of the ethnographic work has been. It's described too in places like Kazakhstan, in places where horse sport happens. And that sort of conversational response both enables the capabilities to compete, to travel, to do the kinds of shared work that's been so important to horse-human relations in many, many cultures in many parts of the world. But it also, one can think of these as almost different linguistic communities that have developed. If I went and got on this Kazakhstani horse and used the signs that I had learned with my English horse, we'd get a bit in a muddle, actually. There's a different language. You could call it a dialect, you could call it a different linguistic community. And they are in turn part of what you could call cultures. So that's quite a simple example, but I'm now going to turn to bats. And I'm really hesitant to say anything about bats in this People and Nature Lab, where your leader, Kate Jones, I regard as the global expert on bats, almost every aspect of bats. And she's also the person who I learned anything I know about bats from in an amazing project that we were part of together, which has stayed with me. And I'm drawing on that work now in slightly different ways. They're 20% of the world's extant mammals, more than 1,400 species, and really notable in this biological revolution for their abilities to fly, to navigate around objects, even catch insects on the wing in complete darkness. And of course, part of the way they do that is by emitting ultrasound signals, listening to the echoes. And that work on echo perception and the way bioacoustics and technologies and AI have helped to elaborate it further. And then the way that through fantastic sites, mechanisms like Bat Detective, people have come to be involved in this kind of interspecies communication are really super important. But we wanted to go a little bit further and say, can one actually see that people also have communicative experience with bats without anything to do with echolocation and echoperception and the technologies which are important to enable people to pick it up? And turning to some of the places where I've worked in West Africa, there we find that actually they do, and you can understand it through perhaps these structural biosemiotics principles. So for instance, in Accra, in Ghana, thousands of fruit bats, Eidolon helvum, inhabit the canopies of the cotton trees in the compound of the main government hospital. And by day, they hang in the trees, they convey their presence through a whole set of signs, their black density contrasting with the open sky around, a pungent smell which contrasts with the traffic smells, different smells out in the street beyond, and that visual presence. Signs picked up by the health workers, the patients, the people who walk about underneath. But as dusk falls, that density sort of lessens as the bats take to the air. They start to fly en masse in a single direction. They circulate, then they head towards feeding sources. And then they often return in a rhythm of days and of seasons, which I think one can understand as a grammatical kind of ordering. And it's part of a structural ordering of human bat life in these places. People will notice if it goes wrong, if the bats don't return. And likewise, perhaps the bats would notice if suddenly the people weren't there, or if life in the hospital from a human point of view had shifted in some fundamental way. And similar sort of communication through structurally ordered signs and grammars is found too in villages like this one in Guinea where I've lived, where bat and human lives are really entangled. They share space. Bats of various species inhabit the canopies of courtyard trees, roof spaces, forest islands forest islands out there in the bush. And their movements are picked up through visual signs, sometimes sound signs. And these, again, are very much part of the diurnal rhythms of village life. Sometimes villagers will comment on bats, the way they share fruit with people, perhaps, or where they are and the sounds they're making. But it more always seemed to us that there was just an appreciation of mutual cohabitation. There was a normality to people and bats being there, a reassuring part of the kind of multi-species sociality that just says life is going on. This is kind of usual. This is part of a healthy ordering of the world. Certainly, people would notice if the bats didn't return, and bats would notice if people weren't there, in ways that have meaning to both. of one kind or another. That differs quite strongly from the sort of UK context where our lives are often lived much more separately from bats. It also is different from some of the arguments that are now emerging from the science policy concern with bats as hosts for viruses that can spill over to affect humans, from Ebola and Marburg and Nipah to COVID-19, and to some of the policy solutions that frequently focus on separating bats from people and trying to kind of block zoonotic spillover through separation. And what we're now finding, as we did when ground zero of the 2013 Ebola epidemic in West Africa, we suddenly found a kind of alliance between sort of rather fortress-focused forest conservationists and people concerned with zoonotic spillover, making arguments for keeping people and bats apart, separating them through fences, or indeed in many parts of the world we've seen through culling bats. Such separation, I think, if one thinks about these ordered more than human lives, would be both inconceivable, probably impossible to do because the bats would go away and they'd just come back, and also be perceived locally as somewhat dangerous, disrupting an orderliness of life and wider ways in which landscapes are experienced as healthy, pointing to the need perhaps for a more accommodative One Health set of approaches that look to maintain that sharing of space while reducing viral transmission risks in other ways. So for a third example, let's go underground to soils, whose loss and exhaustion of fertile soils is, of course, a massive topic of scientific and policy concern. And while some soil scientists and managers still treat soils as simply a matrix for crops, soil ecologists, of course, are revealing a vast quantity and variety of life in soils, macro and microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, interacting with a whole set of chemical processes. Yet many scientists looking at these would understand them in quite mechanical ways: a soil ecosystem, a food web in a soil, maintained through quite mechanistic interactions amongst their component parts, like in food web models. Yet, I think we can argue that a lot of what's going on underground in soils is semiotic. It does involve the sharing of signs, indexical ones, ones that link through what they represent, through chemical senses, through the movement of worms underground. A lot of those are inaccessible to people and to the people who might want to farm or garden without specialist technologies, and those are emerging. But I think what we're finding by taking a kind of structural biosemiotics lens, you can realize that it's not necessary to appreciate all the details of those signing processes and the meaning shared with other soil beings to participate in what one might call soil conversations, because that can be done by picking up on these higher order packaged meta signs. So one example of a meta sign might be a worm. One finds a worm in the soils one is dealing with, and that can become a sign of a whole package of meanings of fertile soil, underneath which there are many processes of breakdown of organic matter, of chemical, biological interactions and signing systems. But finding that worm is a signal that we can say, okay, this is actually going to be a fertile place, a place where trees might do well, as they did in this middle picture, which was us trying to establish a very, very nascent woodland in our field at the beginning of lockdown, where our wilding network volunteers who are helping us and the other volunteers said, look for the worms, and when you find worms, then you'll know that put your seedling there, that's likely to be a good place. So worms as a meta sign. So these garden soils here aren't just wormy, they're also black, they're also dark. And I think colour, which is, of course, the stock in trade of formal scientific soil classifications, which work by colour, And they're also part of the kind of categories you find in often social science sort of ethnopedagogical categorizations, like a black soil, a dark soil, a light soil. Tells one something about the chemical compositions. Perhaps it tells one something about the biological, the semiotic processes going underneath. But the colour itself can be a meta sign which tells one something about fertility. In a way, it packages all those other processes up together. And we found that very, very strongly in the work we did in communities in Guinea and in Liberia, where people would say a black soil is a fertile soil. There were local terminologies for it, and had a very strong understanding of the processes that developed a black soil. And in particular, it was the way that the deposition and throwing of waste, of ash, of agricultural processing waste from cooking fires behind villages, which would lead to the build-up of deep, rich black soils over time, which do some soil science on it, and you find they're also very carbon rich, and that's the black carbon is part of what enables these to be distinctive, and actually quite good for fixing carbon at the same time. But these were soils that people knew and gave names to, which also evoked the land of an old abandoned village, and people would find that where these black soils had been created in interaction with human settlements, and then they moved on, you would get a remnant black soil in the landscape. So indeed, over time, territories built up, which were patches of dark soil and background red soil. And that very soil contrast then carried a whole set of meanings about the social and political relations and the settlement patterns, as well as the biological processes which had led to that patterning. So considering sort of soil assemblages in this way as kind of more than human parts of conversations conducted through signs and meta signs, and almost as archives that package up the meanings of life, often over long periods in particular places. Also, I think helps us one understand the emotional, the affective relations that people often have with their lands, and why they're often so keen to stay in and protect particular territories, as well as giving us clues perhaps to the ways that as humans we might work with living soil processes to align those and enable all of us to thrive. So those are just some examples, and the book expands on a range of others, and I hope begins to convey how this kind of structural biosemiotics lens talks about some processes that we know about, but in a slightly different way, which offers perhaps some new things. So in terms of implications for science, what we're trying to suggest is that this perhaps is a way of thinking that could help the biological revolution, which really, if it's going to go on, needs to get to grips, I think, more thoroughly with a theory of meaning, and to overcome this kind of residual mechanomorphism that is there in some of the methods, in some of the understandings. For the social sciences, I think it's pushing to extend further those understandings of the world beyond the human social, beyond the anthropology, to recognize that these things actually work together. I think it brings a hitherto quite missing focus on language and communication to the burgeoning field of post-human, more than human studies, environmental humanities. And I think particularly importantly, and one of our big arguments, is this brings, I think, a further layer of validity and legitimization to Indigenous theorizing and the theorizing of everyday and citizen communities, for whom these hierarchies have never really existed, and actually more than human communication in companionships in everyday life is simply germane to the way things are. So this, I think, has a few implications for kind of policy and politics, and going back to those ideas about how we try and build more transformative approaches. And I just want to run through a few of them. I think it adds to the challenges to separation. So much of our policy world, from the 30 by 30 protectionism that is part of the global biodiversity framework, to the new forms of nature finance, which rely on kind of chopping up ecosystems into particular commodities that can then be monetized and marketized, rely on dividing humans from these more than human relations within which they're embedded. And they're often resisted. They often end up being what in earlier work colleagues and I described as green grabbing, which often dispossesses people of land and leads to problems of disruption. But I think what we can see perhaps a little bit more fully, and I've come to learn through going through this book process, is that these are also ruptures to culture and community and to communicative relations. Separate people or turn their more than human worlds into commodities, and you're rupturing communicative linguistic relations which are actually deeply part of people's lives and maybe perhaps need nurturing and protecting. So it then suggests and I think adds to many of the very positive arguments where we're finding hope in pathways to mutual thriving of people and nature, around areas like nature recovery, rewilding, regeneration, arguments about care, arguments about nurture. And I think this can help by strengthening those arguments that connection matters, and by looking to the connections that are there and understanding how those are communicative and cultural, can actually give greater grounds to what needs to be fostered and protected and taken forward. That in turn takes us to what we might want to recognise as having rights. I think one of the most exciting policy areas that I'm seeing at the moment is the movement around the rights of nature, which is now recognising not just that non-human beings might have rights, as in older work on animal rights, but also that a whole, I would see it as a more than human community. Take a river and the animals, the plants, the elements that make up that river are now beginning to acquire status in law. This is the river that flows through my hometown of Lewes, which was declared as a living entity with its own charter of rights just last year. But the impetus to do that, and there are now about 40 rivers with rights charters in the UK, but a lot of those community groups have been advised by barristers and legal scholars and Indigenous scholars from countries like Ecuador, where Monica Ferrier-Tinta started her life, which recognition of rights of nature has been fundamentally part of constitutions, where Pachamama, as kind of Mother Earth, has been part of the Ecuadorian constitution for a long time. And so that learning is now coming into other parts of the world too. And then I think it shows us ways that the non-human and the more than human can also be part of political and policy processes. Mainstream theory and policy has been about humans. It's assumed that it's only human beings who can have political agency, and that often has to work through this narrow notion of spoken and written language. And yet we're seeing, I think, blossoming around the world, forms of storytelling that are drawing on and portraying those cultures that are more than human, sometimes through forms of storytelling and action where there's a person who is representing the more than human, which was the case just last week, where this photograph here came from a reimagining conservation forum that the ICA consortium and the people who are part of that shared at the IUCN's World Conservation Congress. But this was humans being the interlocutors for more than human and the non-human. But we might want to ask, can non-human beings communicating through these structural biosemiotic principles also on their own accounts convey their agency? This was certainly the argument that has been made by a wonderful Dutch scholar called Eva Meyer, using the case of the way geese made their presence and their agency felt around the expansion of Schiphol Airport. And we can understand, I think, now the formation, the visual signs, the grammar, the rhythms of their flight, and the way it interrupted what the airport authorities were trying to do in terms of planning for a new runway in structural biosemiotic terms. And those authorities took notice, and that was a protest by geese that in effect did actually make a difference. So those are some of the implications that I think are quite fruitful that we might want to take forward. I think there's an agenda out there which is very large, and this book is only putting a toe into a bigger agenda. But what we want to do is help to take forward some conversations that to date haven't been very well connected with each other, but perhaps could become so. And maybe that would be valuable to all of us in our different ways as we try and build thriving futures for people and nature on this planet that we all share. Thank you very much.
Interesting. I'm really glad to hear. I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. And then we have a tea and coffee reception. So I've got I can see the chat online as well. So if anyone's got a question, please do. Izzy.
Thank you for the really, really interesting talk. And I really love the linking of the biological processes to the anthropology.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to build on that a little bit because there's a lot of, I think as a biologist, there's a lot of a language and a culture of conflict and power in the non-human world. And I'm wondering how that particular language might translate into a relationships between human and nature in a world where we are struggling with our own power and conflict. How do those relationships draw across?
That's a really interesting question, and I guess so. There are examples in the book which do look at questions of conflict, questions of power in that sense. I think they're there in our chapter about forests and how people relate to forests. They're there in the chapter on seas and relations amongst different parts of marine communities. I think what I find quite interesting is that in the biological world, conflict and power is often interpreted straight back in a slightly mechanical way to be what is functional to survival, what is functional to feeding, to sort of predator-prey relationships, what is then functional to evolution as competition and conflict and survival. I think that whereas you look at sort of conflict in the human world, and one is immediately into a whole set of intricate discussions of meaning, of position, of power, of action and of agency. And I think there are opportunities to deepen the way conflict is the way we as analysts seek to understand conflict in the biological world. Perhaps we can also look to how that happens in interspecies relations. And our main focus in this book has not been about what is happening amongst happening within non-human species. It's been about interspecies relations. And I think we can understand both how different kind of more than human cultures and communities might compete with each other, but also about how those relations between different species kind of in those communities can also sometimes be conflictual. But a slightly bigger web of meaning to how those conflicts arise, how they then get dealt with, and how they play out. Yeah.
In supposing that something inherently has meaning, whether it intends to have meaning or not, or whether something takes a meaning from it or not, or even if, for instance, something intends to have a meaning, but something receiving it doesn't actually understand what that meaning is, and how that is always different to language.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great question, and it gets absolutely to the heart of sort of what we're trying to do in this, and that word intention is key, because we sometimes assume that meaning is something that people, because we don't really think about meaning in the non-human world, that meaning comes through intention, and you want to convey something, you've got a particular message, and you intentionally convey it to somebody else, and language, written and spoken language, is part of that. But actually, where I think the social scientists help us is to see both meaning as not so direct, but a question of sort of webs of meaning that are conveyed in all sorts of ways, some of which are unintentional as well as intentional. And that's where language comes into play. The meanings that we create in a social world come through things like the way we're dressed, the way we behave, the way we're positioned in relation to others. There's meaning at the moment in the way I'm standing here at the front of the room. That's a sort of authority that's been conveyed on me as the speaker in this talk, and where you're all sitting. That's about meaning, and the language one would need to kind of get to grips with that sort of meaning is not just narrow speech and language. It's a structural notion of linguistics, which is about the grammar of place, of ordering of who is speaking and how. So it's actually what we try to do is take away intentionality, which is quite important to move out of the human, because of course if you want to see everything as direct and intentional, then you've got a bit of a problem where you're talking about creatures like bats or soil organisms, let alone plants, which do not have the kind of intelligence which has been seen as being able to make that kind of cognitive decision. I mean, the work on non-human animal intelligence is advancing very, very fast. But even regardless, what we're trying to offer is a notion of language and a kind of theory of ways in which meanings are conveyed, which doesn't depend on a kind of theory of mind or of cognition and intelligence in the ways that our sciences have conventionally understood it. No. We're saying that in our cultures, in our communicative worlds, meaning is both conveyed and picked up through grammars, through the juxtapositions of signs in these structural ways. As well as, I mean, that's not to say there aren't kind of very direct forms of communication, but that is not all. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we'll have to leave it there for time reasons.
Yeah.
Let's thank Melissa very much. We have actually organised a reception with tea and coffee on the second floor of Marshgate, and everybody is welcome to come and to continue our conversations and allow many people to say hello and before
Lovely.
Mr. departing from us. So thank you
Thank
again
you.
for visiting, and thanks to everybody who joined online, and to Raphael who helped me with the logistics and organising. If you, especially the early career folks, if you ever want to give me an idea for a seminar speaker or a seminar theme, please do either come and talk to me or email me. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you all for your questions. We can carry on talking.
Yeah. That was super. Thank you
That
so
right.
much.